Welcome to the fourth lecture of this series. As many of you know and some of you may not, this is organized by the second year master's class. It's a rather ambitious lecture series. The full schedule is on the front table where you came in. I hope there's enough for all of you that want it, but you should pick it up so that you can decide to come every week when you see that the entire thing is going to be, I think, quite a rich experience. The other thing that's also on the front table is the SCI-Arc workbook, student workbook, which is the first workbook in 19 years that's a comprehensive overview of the work here. The work in here is from the last 2 years. They're going fast. So let me give this back to her before I forget. This evening we have Chris Macdonald. He's teaching he's a visiting studio critic in one of the advanced studios here this semester. The biographical stuff. Born in Canada, lives in London, has become, I guess, bi-continent, coming back and forth between the U.S. and England. He graduated in '79 from the AA, the Architectural Association, and got the top diploma prize for that year. Since then, he's been in private practice with Peter Salter in London, and he's been teaching at the AA. Many of us have become familiar with the work, which is competitions and invented projects through publications, the normal, what I call the normal international publications, and a quite beautiful one that the AA is known to put out from, I don't know, 4 years ago. Some thoughts of mine and some from Peter for me looking at the work, which I find actually some of the most stimulating stuff that's being done currently. A few years ago, in a statement about their work, Chris Macdonald and his partner Peter Salter wrote of their concern for the particular circumstances of locale and the opportunity still afforded by thoughtful construction. And they went on to say that their work has often been characterized as romantic, to which they responded, "Certainly we hope that our enduring optimism is evident." I believe extraordinarily brave in 1987 when this quote was made, or now for that matter, to use words like romanticism and optimism, which you usually find as excuses for intellectual laziness, amateurism, and a regressive or at least futile and sentimental way of looking at the world. But in examining their work, one rediscovers romanticism and optimism which aren't narrow or blind. An accomplishment probably has something to do with the way Chris Macdonald and Peter Salter have rehabilitated Goethe's idea of keeping nature as your frame of reference. Of course, nature as it appears in their work has nothing to do with the cliches or so-called green architecture, pastoral kitsch, or mania for gadgetry. Their nature consists not of images but processes. In describing the folly they built in Osaka, Chris Macdonald spoke of the relation between architecture, the cycles of nature, the seasonal changes, and the natural forces which affect buildings, which often conflict with modern materials and practice. There's a temptation to explain this sensibility by reference to Chris Macdonald's background in environmental studies in the mid-'70s. In their work, nature in question is clearly not the non-urban utopia of the disillusioned city dweller, but one finds the sensibility of a naturalist, a scientist, who also is an architect. The work is somewhat reductive, and I feel conceptually very, very rich. The sensuality of materials, the sensuality of the direct experience of architecture figures strategically in their work. some of the phrases: the architect and craftsman, potency and physical presence, grounding of construction in its circumstance, subliminal, even primitive communication. Chris will explain what this means, I hope. Chris Macdonald.
Thank you very much. And I suppose now I just have to illustrate all of those remarks. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Michael, for originally inviting me. What I'm going to do this evening is give a lecture which is really a series of several distinct collections of material, one of which I suppose is an introduction and some thoughts about what one might describe as a kind of sensibility that could be brought to bear in the practice of architecture. There's a series, so I suppose that's a general introduction to my interest in architecture. There's a brief sort of bridging piece which very briefly looks at some of the work that Peter Salter and I have done over the last 8 or 9 years to give something of the flavor for how some of these interests were being pursued in our practice. And then really the bulk of the material after that is a description of the folly that Michael mentioned, which was after many years of kind of committing an incredible amount of energy and effort in drawings and models and projects which for various reasons didn't come to fruition. It was a very tiny but I think fairly rewarding building project that we were involved with last year. And I think that part of the lecture is really a little bit about something of the development of this scheme and the kind of the context in the broad sense of how the Folly project came about. And then a more particular discussion about some of the forms of construction, which I think in this case, although the building is, I think the whole thing would pretty much sit in this room. So, I mean, it's a fairly trivial bit of building in some ways. There was a couple of particular things to do with the way in which it was built that I think are of more general interest. These aren't working. Do I need to do something to turn them on, or you need to do something to turn them on? No. Well, well, we're sorting out that technical thing. This is a quote from a man called David Pye, who wrote a book about the nature and art of workmanship. And it seemed like something that was particularly pertinent to the making of things in general, but it seemed like it might also be an idea about working that might be appropriate to think of as an architect, as a workman as well. At the risk of being pedantic, I'll read them. It's just if the words aren't there, I'm not sure you'll understand them. If I must describe a meaning to the word craftsmanship, I shall say as a first approximation that it means simply workmanship using any kind of technique or apparatus in which the quality of the result is not predetermined but depends on the judgment, dexterity and care which the maker exercises as he works. The essential idea is that the quality of the result is continually at risk during the process of making. And as I say, this is a statement particularly about, be it the joiner or the metal worker or whatever, but seemed like one that was interesting to imagine appropriate to the tasks of the architect. Okay. Whoop. Stop it. Okay. I beg your pardon? They're not working at all. Sorry, let's go. Difficult start. I think there's something fundamental about the discussions that Peter and I have had over the last 10 years, both as teachers and practitioners. I don't know whether it has much to do with studying environmental science or not, but it certainly has something to do with coming to some understanding that architecture is it cannot be understood out of the broad social context in which it operates, and that at one end of that social context, I suppose one might use the phrase settlement as a general catch-all, which has to do with some sense of a kind of custodianship of the landscape, a sort of slightly troublesome word from the Bible, but the idea of husbandry of the land seems like it, I think in at least its one sense of its meaning, a kind of point of reference. This is the slide on the left is both of these from the New World. The slide on the left is a Mennonite community in Bolivia, showing those very first and at this scale from a Landsat image, rather delicate impositions of some sense of artifice and order on the landscape. And the slide on the right is a picture of a farmstead in Canada. It does seem that out of this idea of kind of husbandry of the landscape or custodianship that is a responsibility comes a kind of commitment to the way in which architecture is fashioned, which is rather different from imagining that architecture begins as a strictly intellectual enterprise. There's a kind of, particularly in these New World instances, a kind of thrilling optimism and sense of discovery involved in this act of settlement, which I think is still has a kind of profound effect on everyone who lives in this landscape. So, look at that. One of the things that seems to come from, if we can say that there's this idea of settlement at one extreme and then moving towards something that we would call architecture, it seems there's a couple of things that come along with that, and one is certainly a healthy respect and enduring interest in the specific nature of materials. The slide on the left is an example that we often refer to. It's a barn from the county of Norfolk in England, and it is made out of three materials, one imported and two local. The third material that you can't see is a kind of chalk which is actually holding the barn up. And this is a material which is fantastically strong in compression, but as you can imagine, not especially good at weathering. The flint is a funny kind of metamorphic rock that you particularly find in beaches in that part of the country, and is fantastic at weathering, but not very good at getting around corners. And then finally the bricks, which are the imported material, are extremely, obviously very good at doing things like openings and corners. And in this case, as one's building up the wall, just striking a level every now and then to keep the whole thing in some kind of order. The slide on the right is I'm afraid I've forgotten the name, a woman architect practicing in New Mexico and Arizona. And it seems like at the scale, let's say, of the craftsman putting the barn together, there is a kind, one can witness in a very palpable way, a kind of strategic sensibility which comes out of the very matter-of-fact acknowledgement of what materials can and can't do. It seemed to me in this instance the idea that there would be one order of structure, which is this rather strange timber porch set out in the desert, and then in a completely separate manner the adobe house which kind of squats underneath it. I think so this essential commitment to the nature of materials. It also seems that, I suppose, the way in which as an architect one has a vested interest in materials is the way in which one fashions the world by manipulating material. And I suppose another theme which seems very critical is the idea that building is a verb as well as a noun, and that after all making a building is really just moving bits of the earth around into a rather different fashion in a kind of desperate attempt to resist entropy. A couple of other examples. I think, although it's certainly not exactly fashionable or widely invited into the practice of architecture at the moment, by and large the architectural practice is given over the manipulation of materials entirely to specialist contractors and builders. But clearly that there is a tradition of this, and I mean these two examples in the 20th century, both extraordinary lessons in the employment of material. I think the one of Ronchot is also very instructive. I don't know if you're all familiar with the kind of art. There's particularly an article by the young, rather bullish Jim Sterling about this building when it was built, and it was seen as a kind of complete, either utterly whimsical or mannered building, because it denied the integrity of the kind of use of materials. Particularly for the kind of new brutalists of Great Britain, this seemed a great kind of turnaround on Corp's part. But in fact, the way in which the building is fashioned has a lot to do with in this case, in the slide you see, the reuse of the stone from the chapel which existed on the site beforehand, and the fact that the very nature of the building being removed from the world made certain kinds of construction problematic. I think also one of the things that is kind of essential interest in the material, manifestly material aspects of the world, it allows us to kind of once and for all kind of shed the distinction between the bicycle shed and the cathedral, imagining that one is interesting to architects and the other is not. And it seems, although one can certainly see a kind of refinement and grace in a Japanese temple on the left, it seems that there are certain issues to do with the manipulation of material and relationship between form and material that are just as eloquent in the vernacular example in a Dutch canal on the right. I suppose if one describes architecture or building as an effort to resist entropy, but also an active thing, not a passive, objective thing, then this whole business of the way in which architecture invites the forces of nature into this discussion comes up fairly quickly. The slide on the left is just a kind of peculiar example of someone trying to have their cake and eat it too, and literally using a growing plant material as part of a construction. And the slide on the right, I think this, we used to run a studio at the AA for a couple of years called the Weather Register, and it was simply to say that the year's project would be to look at the possibilities offered by thinking of architecture as a weather register. While we were doing that, we came across this extraordinary book, a sort of real act of passion and almost obsession by a man also in Norfolk, who for a period of 35 years, this is the same daffodil clump photographed on the 1st of February. And there are pages of these. And then there's the first snow, the snowdrops on the same spot of his property, photographed on the 1st of January, and the same beech twig on the 1st of March. And then this extraordinarily kind of bizarre text which described what the weather was like. And there is certainly something about living in England for a few years that makes this all seem much more gripping than I suppose it does than to someone in Southern California. So I thought you had to see a little bit of that kind of obsession, the whole thing of living on an island and having the weather going by you constantly. But it certainly does seem that within this sense of building as a verb, the idea of natural cycles and the relationship between both the cycles of the occupants as well as the natural world in which these buildings are located seems, again, a rather poignant one. And I came across these rather peculiar slides of the Staatsgalerie extension in Stuttgart. And these can't have been taken more than about maybe 4 years after the completion of the building, and it did seem that what on the drawings seemed a pretty cheesy idea of having these vines creeping over the stonework. It makes a kind of incredible difference to the sense of the building. I think but that's just a few brief, let's say, points of reference that might help frame view of some of the work that we did in the last few years. I think also it would be fair to say that in the midst of all of that, there's probably a kind of ongoing formal struggle with Cartesian and non-Cartesian forms that, just as Monsieur Le Corbusier was struggling at different scales, I think is something that's very apparent in the work. Just in case anyone felt prompted to ask the trick question of what has all that got to do with the interest in nature and process and all of that, I'm not too sure. But I think it's fair to acknowledge that it is a rather distinct preoccupation and can be seen in all of the work, really. I'm just going to, as I say, very briefly go over some very old projects, mostly as a way of introducing the work to those of you who aren't familiar with it. This is also a small extension to a museum, and I think there isn't much I won't say much about it except that in doing this work one was often very bloody-minded about the way in which the building responded to something, in this case like light and view and slope. And so it literally, the curved roof, which looks positively kind of antique now, literally is kind of thrusting back in to arrive normal to the slope of the territory. There's this great contrivance of the two walls at the front of the building to deliberately exclude the light but afford a kind of view through the treetops across the valley of the site in Durham. And against that, a kind of preoccupation with using reinforced concrete as a material which is very firmly rooted in the ground, and then a kind of steel structure and with corten and galvanized cladding outside and in, as a completely separate piece, kind of crouched on top of that, and a glass floor. And I think the nature of the idea of something very artificial and manufactured, the glass floor and the steel structure perched above the kind of archaeological remains of the reinforced concrete structures, fairly clear in these plans. And then a series of small models we did for an exhibition some years ago, showing only the reinforced concrete structure as the piece which is the kind of primary strategy of settling a building in that locale and setting up certain sort of procedural consequences which then get acted out in the more developed building. And the slide on the right is just a collage showing that kind of twilight space between the concrete and steel structures at the edge of the front elevation. The same kind of essay in concrete, as reinforced concrete, is something which had this capacity to ground a building in a rather ambiguous circumstance. It was used in a little pavilion in Stoneleigh in Warwickshire. And this was aggravated by the fact that the building was would be the equivalent of a kind of state fair, but for all of England. And so the building had to be completed within, 361 days in order that it could be operating the next year. So in this case, the idea of the procedures of construction and materials being exercised so that the concrete is very rough indeed, much like an English motorway. And while all of that's going on, there's a series of much finer timber constructions, including this 3-story one that you see on the right-hand side of the slide, and a number of screens and infill pieces, like a kind of shop fitting exercise on again, a rather archaeological creature created very roughly and quickly. It's a house that we designed not far from London, about an hour's drive from London. And I think after doing a series of institutional buildings, often in competition, this is a project which was much more elaborate in its anticipation of use. And I suppose, I'm not quite sure how to describe that, but imagining that if there's an attention to things like particular material qualities or the constancy of the sun or natural cycles as a way of setting up the project. It seems that certainly there's some idea that those are fulfilled in some kind of reciprocal manner by the occupancy of the building in due course. And that very intense moment when the material of the world is shifted into being a recognizable building has these moments of sort of relative quietude of activity on either side. I won't say much more about that except that kind of, again, strategically setting the building alongside a river and trying to enjoy peripheral oblique views up and down the river, but also invite sun through a kind of extended conservatory by an orchard on the south side, which is the right-hand side of that plan. One of the cross sections, another whole series of developed sections working through the building. And the plan, and I think again, seeing something of this interest in kind of interruptions of the essentially Cartesian organization. And then more recently, we were involved in the last of the IBA projects in Berlin. And again, not going to say much about it, just to show something of I suppose the presumption for me to say that the issues that those first few slides demonstrated an interest in have been acted out in varying circumstances and scales of work. One of these strange IBA programs where one did a kind of, in this case, 2 half-city blocks. A large kind of institutional building that occupied one part of the site. It was a kind of, what would you call it? I suppose like a small convention center kind of thing. And then I think vis-a-vis the idea about occupation, perpetuating some idea of process, instead of doing these kind of rather tacky council houses for Berlin, there was an idea that there would be this extremely forthright and robust structure. There's a steel model of it on the left, that would then be occupied much more in the manner of a kind of warehouse loft conversion, anticipating that increasingly people might choose to work out of their dwellings. Okay. So that's something of the kinds of context in which we had been working. The Berlin project rather undermined by the fact that the promoters decided that Mr. Libeskin's scheme should win and didn't leave much room for the kind of collaboration which we had originally intended. The woman who commissioned us for the house on the River Lambourne, it's like terrible stories really, sort of dying in the midst of developing the design. So it was all getting a little discouraging at some point. And we were invited as one of a number of people, including Morphosis from the United States, to make these very small buildings in Japan as part of the Osaka fair of Greenery. And this rather peculiar idea that there would be no program for the building except that it had something to do with man and nature in the 21st century. And I think you'll see a couple of slides of what the Osaka version of man and nature in the 21st century is, and it's pretty shocking. I think for Peter and I, this seemed like a real, apart from the fact that we reckoned that the Japanese were neither going to kind of die on us nor do a sort of avant-gardist end around, that somehow this building was going to be built. And it did seem to us that the idea of architecture and nature in the 21st century seemed a perfectly reasonable thing to make a little building about. And so we set to it. I'm going to show really a series of three sort of preliminary and a final version of the scheme. And then, as I say, I'll talk a little bit about some of the construction of elements of the building. I don't know that there's much. Oh, the other interesting thing, 2 other interesting things about the nature of the overall proposal was one, that the building had to be temporary. There were a couple of permanent buildings built as part of this fair, but the follies were by and large to be destroyed at the end of about 6 months. And the other was that the initial guideline, if you want, was this, it would be a 7.5 meter cube, which was really just a sort of effort to keep the costs in control somehow. But as you might gather, even superficially looking at the earlier work, 7.5 meter cube didn't seem like a good place to start, although we ended up surprisingly close to it. I think the thing about the fact that it was a temporary building is it seemed one of the first issues that we started to model and draw around and towards was that something of the inevitable aging process of a building might be invited and indeed kind of aggravated, so that in the course of those 6 months, something of a whole kind of process of kind of patina of aging would take place. In this case, the idea of these 3 very small pavilions, which would be set into another kind of landscape of larger scaled elements. And there was a piece made out of lead, clad in lead, with an artificial light source, which is a kind of funny herbal garden. And then 2 small steel pavilions, one of which was encouraged to essentially rust away during the 6 months and become increasingly delicate as the fair went on. And these are what you call them really, conceptual models, I think. And this shows something of the idea of the landscape into which we were thinking of locating them. Almost impossible to understand, well, certainly very difficult for us to anticipate what the final context would be. But certainly, I think the figures were extraordinary. I mean, something like 30 million or 40 million people were going to traipse through this fair during the course of this 6 months. And it did seem from the description of it that there was going to be an awful lot of asphalt and kind of tacky sort of theme park stuff going on. And at this point in the first proposal, you can see the back of the little lead building and then the 2 sort of steel bottles sitting inside this landscape, and a kind of sort of reverse archaeological rock outcrop, which at this time we'd hoped to be able to use a kind of stone called Oya stone, which was the stone that Frank Lloyd Wright used in the Imperial Hotel, and deteriorates extremely rapidly. The only other thing we knew about the site was on this bit here was going to be a monorail station, which seemed the proximity of the monorail station and the idea of man and architecture and nature in the 21st century did seem a bit odd, but Japan seemed a bit odd, so we thought we'd have a run at it. And anyway, the screen wall, which is a very thin but 3-dimensional matrix of timber structure at this stage, you can get something of the scale of it, but that's a very narrow ramp leading up into the opening there on the model. But an idea that would be something of the scale of the monorail passing by, and there would be glimpses through these rather large openings of the 2 steel bottles behind. One of them increasingly aging as the monorail went round and round. I think it would be fair to say that when that particular version was presented to the client, it met with mixed reviews. They seemed very keen on the idea of quite deliberately exercising some sensibility to do with nature and building, but the idea of things deteriorating, and I think the English translation of the word they used was rot, didn't seem to be quite so appealing. I think the other thing is that it had been very difficult for us to have a measure of how many people might reasonably be expected to brush by this building, and as it seemed like it might be very many indeed. It also seemed that the idea of these 2 steel bottles one of which was rusting away, would be becoming extremely expensive to build in the time frame we had, or rather crude in their execution. So this is a kind of seriously revised version where somehow the two bottles are now made out of a kind of laminated plywood and raised up off instead of the experience of the building having to be with climbing within the building to get within these small pavilions, one uses them as a kind of frame of the sky set within this three-dimensional matrix of timber. The other thing that you can see, particularly in the top of the plan, is an idea of, again, for lots of sort of circumstantial reasons, but instead of using the Oya stone, beginning to propose making some very thick walls out of a kind of rammed earth construction, which you'll see more of later. But the essential, the one order or scale of elevation which was able to compete with the scale of the monorail station, the idea of a very local landscape which contained views and allowed you to withdraw from the kind of cacophony of the World's Fair. The kind of gourd structures now being used to frame the sky, but having withdrawn underneath what we were calling a cage by this point. There's just a tiny little model at, I think, 1/16 of an inch to a foot. So there's another layer of finer matrix of timber which is not included here, but one can get something of the scale and general disposition of the pieces. And that's again this rather large scale elevation which addresses the primary point of approach. I won't say much about all of the particular reasons why each scheme changed to the other, but I suppose my interest in showing them, if we go back to the original quote about workmanship and craftsmanship, the idea that work is undertaken without a clear anticipation of its form in conclusion, but I suppose a set of parameters and sensibilities to operate within, in which issues can be explored in an open-ended way. And this scheme, largely to do with the question of money, really, and time, partly. This scheme was prepared literally in an afternoon as a way of adjusting to some of the difficulties with the earlier scheme. And as you can see, the gourd is now singular. The cage is much smaller, and in fact very nearly the 7.5 meter cube which had shocked us at the beginning. And the way of grounding, because these earthen walls were, no one really knew quite how to build them, and so the contractor involved put in some rather silly prices for them. But the thickness of the wall has been dislocated so that there's a series of earthen plugs, and you can see in the far right of the section one of these which is pushing up against the cage and gourd. The idea of the big elevation has also been diffracted somehow, and there's a series of flat screens. There's the one that you see in section. If you look to the right-hand side of the plan, there's another much larger one, like a series of elements of an elevation that are in a kind of a sort of maelstrom of movement and circulation, which is the condition of the site. All of this then, again, in the effort to try and ground this thing and make it absolutely distinct from the oceans of tarmac all around, there is literally an excavation into the earth, some of which is used to make these rammed earth walls, and the remainder is then formed into this slightly kidney-shaped mound which is planted with bamboo. I think these are fairly self-explanatory, but you can see this is with the cage and gourd removed, and another freestanding curvilinear screen containing your horizon within the space, so that you drop down a slightly undulating ramp, and by the time you step into that space, the sky is framed through a kind of oculus of the gourd, and your view of things like the monorail, etc., is gone entirely. Certainly the idea of the garden being another kind of bamboo garden, registering the passage of the 6 months in another manner. And in the slide on the right, you can see something of the relationship of these plugs of earth as this kind of geological fixture, and then holding with each of them having a kind of assignment of one of these blank bits of screen. Again, in that model, there's a tertiary layer of timber lattice, which is not there. Another couple of views of the kind of configuration of the plan. So that's the scheme as it developed finally, and I think it was built in about 3 months, as far as I recall. Yes, 3 months. And there were a couple of qualities about the construction that it seemed, although one was interested in the formal manipulation and the kind of composition of these elements in this unimaginable landscape in which they were to occur. We were particularly interested in, first of all, in the idea of the excavation into what would become the Sea of Tarmac, and then the way in which the rammed earth could be entertained as a general proposition, but something that we could never describe entirely. So if we think of that in under a general heading of grounding, I'll describe something about that. And then really the Cajun gourd as, I suppose, a more deliberate and I suppose more articulate pursual of some of these interests in Cartesian and non-Cartesian geometry, which had been exercised in earlier projects. And I suppose in that case, rather more straightforward constructionally. These drawings are just a kind of summary of, so this is the excavation with the mounded bamboo garden, Cajun gourd. And on the right, all of the earthen constructions and the various flat screens that go with them. So if one can imagine that on the left, there's a very deliberate effort to center something, and furthermore to give it a kind of primitive, I think is probably fair, primitive quality of literally being dug into the earth. And then the slide on the right is this kind of much more sophisticated deployment of elements of solidity and elevation, somehow attempting to acknowledge the peculiarities of the circumstance which would be developing around. Here we are, architect on the site. I'm the one who's rather taller than the others. This was the site that we found, and we thought, well, this looks like a pretty good place to think about architecture and nature, quite a bucolic setting, and our site was beginning at that crossroads and then pushing back into the hill. So much of the early work we did was all about controlling perspectival views of slope and drawing in kind of horizon of trees in the background. The slide on the right is what it looked like a year later. A kind of essay about man and nature in some other capacity. And you can see on the left there, behind the pitched roof, the cage and gourd as they were constructed. So just a little bit now about this thing of grounding, and then in both in a general sense and as a sort of deliberate engagement with the surface of the earth, and then also the particular things which had to do with making these earthen walls. I mean, certainly, I think if one refers back to that very first plan of the Durham Museum extension and this interest in the archaeological nature of reinforced concrete construction, manipulating the surface of the earth in a way to kind of demonstrate its, I don't know, what would you say, demonstrate, I suppose, the fragility of the surface of it. Seemed like something that in this general idea of exposing a lot of the consequences of building to be collapsed together into 6 months and what might be a very fleeting visit seemed important to slightly caricature in the building. This is a kind of rubble and earthen wall in the West Country in Great Britain. The slide on the right is, I don't know if you're aware of it, is a Glaswegian family of sculptors who make these pieces of the surface of the earth at 1-to-1 facsimile scale, and then do this very disarming thing of putting them up on walls in galleries. And there seems like there was some interest in establishing that the very thin patina of what we consider to be the sort of artificial world that we construct for ourselves. At a slight one of many difficulties in trying to transpose this idea into discussion about literally the means of constructing it in Japan. The slide on the right of a very ancient, I think 900-year-old mud wall in Kyoto. But our contact architects somehow, when we kept talking about mud walls, what they thought we meant was that you would build this sort of trestle of 2x4s and sling a little render on it. And it would look almost like that. So we had a fairly lengthy education period where we tried to convince them that this isn't at all what we had in mind. I mentioned earlier on that the building was a temporary one, and I suppose when we had first thought about building something in Japan, there's the kind of conceit of wanting to make it even more beautiful concrete than Mr. Ando, which was our immediate response. And then we were told we weren't allowed to do that because it was a temporary building, and we somehow found our way to this idea of a kind of Pise construction, rammed earth with essentially no additive to it, a little bit of lime but no cement. I should also say that the contact architects we had were Atelier Mobile from the Team Zoo, and really unquestionably interesting collaboration, and certainly the quality of the building would not be what it was without their active support on the building site. I'm sorry, that's back to front. This is a drawing of Peter's, which is a kind of setting out drawing, and the drawing on the right is one we discovered later of Mr. Le Corbusier, who in one of his notorious conversations with the provisional government of France during the latter part of the war years was looking at Pise as a way of making very low-cost housing in parts of France. I'm afraid what you can't see there, but some of the notes on the drawing are rather interesting because they say like minor fluctuations within strata to be encouraged. And our idea was not simply to make a kind of immaculate earth wall, like the kind of beautiful adobe walls that one sees sometimes in the Southwest, but that it would be sufficiently rough and ready that it would also age much more quickly during the course of the 6 months, part of the time being monsoon time. The other thing is that really what's set out is a sort of recipe for how to make the wall, with an understanding that it would be impossible for us to draw an accurate elevation. And all it in this case does is, I think, literally take the volume of building divided by 21 days, which we reckoned was about what they'd have, and then work up from a datum all the way up to the top of the tallest wall. So in any given day, more or less is being put in any given day. The color or density of the earth would be up for grabs to some extent. The only real condition that we made was that there would be this string course of tiles laid on edge, which would establish where the original ground level would be. So you can see on the top left there's a drawing of, I don't know, a kind of cartoon of what this might be. But as I say, without any clear understanding of what would happen on site. So once again, this notion of certain consequences being allowed to take place, being not just allowed, but invited into the idea of the building, and to some extent the very quality and substance of the building being at risk. On the right is a drawing which was taken over in one of the visits to try and explain something of this kind of hairiness which we were after. I think when you see the finished work, it obviously worked to some extent. And this is the incredibly kind of crude method of making these walls, just a bit of timber shuttering and literally someone pounding it in. The man in the back of the left-hand photograph is making one of these flat screens, the kind of fragmented elevation that I described earlier. And it's just a conventional Japanese technique of using interlaced bamboo as a lath and then plastering over it with mud with bits of straw in it, which is in fact the technique that our contact architect had originally assumed that we intended. One of the consequences of deploying that technique is you'll see that it has an incredibly powerful texture on the back side of it. These are the walls just as the forms are being struck. And this is what they look like at the end of the day. The contractor for this little folly is somehow connected with the people who were paying for it. And the people who were paying for it said, well, we've got this contractor somewhere over here in the organization, and they're specialists in exhibition design, and this is an exhibition, isn't it? So we'll get them on board. And the first two buildings that they built out of doors, this was the one, and the second one was the Folly by Kopimmelblau. And I think that was kind of a real trial by fire for them. You can see some of the deterioration of the wall. Both this pair and the next pair are taken probably only about 3 or 4 weeks after the construction had been completed. And certainly going back 3 months later, I mean, there's kind of little moss gardens growing here and there. But that gives you something of also the difference between what the quality of the wall dry and, in this case, fairly damp. Sorry if I got that upside down. No. Sorry. So this idea of it being at risk, what happened was this poor builder had never built any kind of wall that was supposed to resist the weather, much less this one. And in fact, building Pisé wall construction is not really part of any traditional Japanese pattern of construction. So every day they'd, as it were, go down to the local grog shop and see if they could rustle up a bit of help, bring them round, and they'd have to be trained in how to make these walls. Well, it meant that instead of 21 days and a much finer striation that we'd been hoping for, the whole thing was built in about 7. So it's very, very coarse, and oftentimes from day to day using the same batch of earth. So that's the end of that little interlude. A cage and gourd, as I say, the construction of them in some cases is much more straightforward than the rammed earth. The cage in particular, we were able to use some very fine carpenters who make tea houses down in Nara. And they did some terrific work, well, some terrific work, some certainly passable. The thing about the gourd that became increasingly problematic was, apart from how to suspend it in a timber frame that didn't seem like it was going to have much structural strength, the obvious fact that in making the non-Cartesian form is about 100 times more difficult in the general collection of building practices that we know and love than building something like the slide on the left. So it went through, as you saw in the very first scheme, the idea of making it out of sheet steel wrapped on a extruded steel frame. It then was going to be made out of laminated plywood by a marine boat builder in Canada, of all places. But the shipping of it became extremely difficult. The contact architect thought that there's a traditional technique of using basically a kind of papier-mâché with a persimmon lacquer. And in the end, it was made out of a sort of artificial kind of canvas by a sailmaker in England. The cage first, I mean, the reason these two must be understood to get together is in the midst of all this prevaricating and finally deciding to make it out of cloth and suspend it from the timber, the carpenter obviously wanted to be getting on with the job. So one prepared a bunch of drawings which tried to, on the one hand, describe very precisely the form of the gourd and also the obverse of that, which would be the point at which all of the timber frame stops. There's our master carpenter on the right with the 4 columns that the cage sits on and some of the jointing. And under construction, I mean, essentially very, very straightforward bit of work. Having made all of these wonderful joints, the inevitable building inspector walked by and decided that they should bang a few bolts in, which seemed rather a pity. But that's why those are there. They're not the workman's idea. Again, because of reasons of cost, that final tertiary level of timber lattice that was intended to be part of the cage was never constructed. So this is as dense as it finally ended up. And you can begin to see one of these flat elevational pieces. As I say, the gourd was problematic. I mean, the incredible liberty of being able to move your wrist and make a shape which seems at once sensuous and expressive of sensuality, and at once complex and like almost inevitably complex and subtle in the way it might register light, for instance. Some study models of that. The slide on the left comes from one of my students got me a membership in the American Gourd Society, and they send you out handy little diagrams like this. I can't imagine what the annual convention must be like. It turned out that sailmakers didn't want to know about those other drawings, didn't like plans and sections very much, and pretty much worked directly from models. So this is a 1:50, what's that, quarter-inch model of the gourd. The grid of the timber lattice then, I mean, is this sort of level of high technology which we employ, and you push a little stick through and measure it and then send the dimension off to Japan in a fax. The model of the gourd is then given to the sailmaker, who literally just takes dimensions off it with a set of calipers, makes a kind of, I suppose, roughly comparable to the kind of pattern for making clothes, and then put it together. Oops. Again, an extremely elegant junction between the two items. Very high technology. I don't think I would include that in what I would call romantic, but does have a certain quality about it. And there you can see something of the quality of light coming through this semi-translucent material, which I think in the end, like many of the decisions which took place in that last round of changes, I think made the scheme infinitely more powerful. In showing you, I'm afraid these slides are not absolutely wonderful, but also if you think back to the slide of the before and after site photographs, somehow while you're watching these last pictures, which really just show various elements of the building as it was finished construction, you have to imagine the sound of the women in the pink satin outfits as they bow and say hello to you. You're coming off the monorail, and this kind of incessant tinny music everywhere, hot, steamy kind of environment. It's this kind of certain sort of smell of, like slightly leftover cooking fat in the distance somewhere. And then this extremely kind of peculiar construction set in the midst of that. So the slide on the right, again showing something of the way in which the gourd finally frames the sky. And as I say, at that point you've lost all of the surfaces that contain the space you're in are the ones of the folly, having lost all sense of the surroundings. And something of the kind of shade cast from the cage onto the gourd. And I think now there's just a sequence of about, I don't know, half a dozen or a dozen slides, more or less wandering around the building. I don't think I have anything much more to say about it. But just that they might help you get a better sense of the piece altogether. Because the site ended up being so congested and kind of put upon by other buildings, there aren't very many complete shots. And while that's slightly frustrating to me and to you, I think it's probably fairly indicative of the way in which the piece was experienced. That slide of seeing it across within this kind of technopop landscape, I think is one experience. Seeing the kind of singularity of the cage and gourd briefly, and then really from that point on, the primary experience of the building was this very vivid collection of surfaces and texture. I forgot to mention it in one of the final version of the project as a model. There's a gap between the orthogonal geometry, which is, as it were, the foundation for the cage, and also the place where the ground has literally been excavated. And you can see some kind of effort to describe that sort of tissue of material between the excavation and the back of the freestanding screen in a way to ensure that it's understood as not terra firma. I think you can start to see the bamboo garden on the left side after it's grown up more. Again, a view underneath looking across the bamboo garden towards the monorail. This is just to give you some idea of scale. I don't have very many photographs with figures in them. This is in fact, a young American boy had been working with Atelier Mobile, who more or less lived on the site, and in a very peculiar Texan drawled Japanese, explaining to these people who were new every day how to make walls out of rammed earth, which is really a kind of pretty brave enterprise, I think. And already starting to see some of the weathering of the timber. You can see in the slide on the right very clearly the back of one of these elevational screens, so that the mud as it pushes through the bamboo lattice, and then at the bottom of the slide, that same thing when viewed from the front. So they're elevational not only in a kind of conceptual sense, but they're also very firmly directed about front and back. A slightly dished floor of end-grain block is the surface that you finally come to rest on, and from there you can see from this slide you're still at the bottom standing on the ramp, and there's like one step further down and you finally do lose that sense of the fairgrounds beyond. The slide on the left is just one of those peculiar coincidences. It's obviously a point of intersection between the geometry of the curved screen and the geometry of the gourd, so that as it rains there's this point of overlap made vivid, registered. Again, something of the intended quality of the way in which the light passing through the three-dimensional matrix of the cage starts to have some, what's the word, engagement with the oblique grid of the end-grain floor and then the lattice of the curving ramp. And the slide on the left is at the bottom of the ramp. Instead of having to retrace one's steps literally, there are 2 steps up and a very brief journey through the middle of the earthen wall and then back out in a much more abrupt manner into the fair. So something of the 2 opposing scales in which the building is somehow preoccupied. Okay, I think it's a very bad photograph of my partner, Mr. Salter, crouching in the doorway, which I think also just shows that within what appears at any one vignette to be quite a kind of visceral surface, and yet, as I say, the whole construction could fit fairly handily in this room, a very petite construction. And I'm just going to read you this little inspirational message, and I think that's excuse me, all I have to say for the evening. An idea in vogue has it that the artist must necessarily be in opposition to his language, that he has to force it, constrain it, and twist its syntax in order to mold it to its own design. However, another definition of art is perhaps not only possible but more accurate, that the real artist is someone who has been able, through patient work, to discover the profound nature of the art he has chosen and its laws, and to fully exploit its forms of expression from the most obvious to the most hidden. These 2 types of artist will always be in opposition. The first lives in a state of continual conflict between his ego and his language, while the second is constantly learning about the increasing concordance of his works and his world. For if he carries it to its limits, the analysis of his art's essential forms necessarily leads him to discover the bonds of secret suitability, linking it to certain objects of the world, and moreover that the laws of his art are perhaps those of the world itself. And that's all. Thank you very much. I don't mind. Normally it's a flat night, they all want to go. I'm around.
Any of you that have any questions can ask them informally out front for a few minutes.